Who in this crowd knows about NLP? Okay, pretty good number. All right. So I'm going to spend relatively little time on NLP, which is a tremendously exciting topic, but personality is an even more exciting topic. So we're just going to do kind of a thumbnail sketch of NLP and then get into personality. And to give you a kind of outline of what we're going to do, first we're going to talk about personality science in general and give an idea of one of the most popular models. We're going to learn about that model, then we're going to apply it just kind of in some exercises and try to understand how it works. And we'll probably take a quick break about that point, come back and finish up a little bit about the subdimensions of personality that are called traits. Then we're going to actually use IBM Watson, which is a cloud service for analyzing personality, and apply it, take a demo of it, see how it works, and then we get into the real serious question of, well, how well does it work? And we'll look at some data on that, where I actually took some personality tests and analyzed essays and compared them, and then we'll get into the details of what works and what doesn't work with Watson and talk about how you can use it for your applications. All right, so there's me. Okay. It'll be in the deck.
You're at the beach or something there, right? Yeah.
You saw it. Right. So, okay, so for those who don't know about NLP, there's really two ways of extracting information from text, right? So one is to understand the data the way that people understand it, and that's the route of model-free methods like deep learning. So that's really all the rage now. It's really important. It's a whole new breakthrough. But there's an older way that has some more advantages. It's a lot more computationally efficient, and it's basically faking it, if you will, and that's NLP. And so what we do with NLP is we find heuristics that give you good results very efficiently with fairly little code. And the way that they do that is they leverage the fact that language has deep structure encoded in it. So even a relatively simple algorithm with such a rich data set can give you useful results. So this is probably something you've all seen before. It's a word cloud. It's a simple NLP algorithm. So what we've done here is we take an essay and we drop out all of the meaningless words or low-value words. We strip them out, and then we stem all of the words so that we reduce them to their prefix, so eliminating suffixes that just add kind of extra information, like whether it's a gerund or it's plural, things like that. It matters so much. And then we score them by their count. We turn into a bag of words, we throw away the actual structure of the document, just score the number of occurrences of words. And what we get out of it is actually pretty useful. This is sort of like a poor man's PCA, for those who know the PCA algorithm. To do this formally, what you do is try to embed the document in some theoretical space, and then find the axes that are most important, the eigenvectors in that space. And that's basically what you get from this. Like, this is, you can look at it and read it and say that this is an essay written by somebody who lives in Lagos and talks quite a lot about what it's like to live in Lagos, who is very interested in the fashion accessories. And in fact, it was actually an essay for somebody applying to design school from Lagos. Right? So that just jumps right out at you pretty quickly. And it's not because the algorithm is sophisticated, because it's not. It's because the data is sophisticated. So you can get some real great value sometimes by using NLP techniques. And we're going to specifically talk about personality, which is really tremendously important to everybody. And it all works because language encodes structure, right? So what we'd like to do is learn some things about how to model personality first off, and then how to derive those models by looking at your output, what you write, what you speak, those kind of things. So I'm going to start with this quick analogy, and that's all your NLP. But maybe other talks in NLP are useful as well. So this is what I call the Marco Polo analogy. So when you start to study personality as a data scientist, what happens is you're kind of reminded of this story, right? This is, Marco Polo goes off to the east, and what he finds is a culture that's really quite sophisticated. It's not like his own at all, but it's not like one of these first contact situations where you have widely differing cultural and technological levels. In fact, he's got some stuff like gunpowder that's pretty useful. They're going to use it to build rockets. It's eventually going to lead to the space program. They've got some stuff like, hey, we've got this technology called paper. It's a platform technology. You probably want to check this out. We run an app on it called Paper Money. Revolutionizes the West, right? Oh, and by the way, on your way out the door, take this compass. It'll really help you in getting back home, right? Leads to the age of navigation, right? So what happens is, you encounter this other territory, and you find that, wow, these people have done a lot of work. They've got all this useful stuff. And so that's what it feels like when you start looking at personality science. So we went to a distant land called psychology, and we find that they have developed these sophisticated models, sophisticated data-based models of human behavior, and they're really quite useful. So,
Can you speak up a little bit? People online are having a hard time.
oh, okay. I'll try to be louder. Okay. So personality researchers or researchers of psychology have identified two major areas that kind of define human potential and human behavior, and those are intelligence and personality. So we're not going to talk about intelligence in this talk. That's a whole other area. Between the two of them, though, they have about 50% of the predictive value of somebody's lifetime arc, the variation between individuals, and I'll talk about what that means in just a minute. So each one counts for about 25%. So there's about 50% that, we just don't understand, that you can't predict very well. But if you know somebody's intelligence is scored on a standardized test pretty well, and you know their personality has scored on a standardized test pretty well, you can make some really good inferences about them. And I liken this to, in data science, we have this thing called the credit score, which I had no respect for at all before I started doing data science. But you realize, because how can you reduce all of somebody's financial estate to just one number, right? I mean, some people have more money than other people and stuff like that. But when you do data science and you work with finances, you realize that the predictive power of the credit score is astonishing, right? You can predict all kinds of things. It predicts your education level. It predicts how well you're going to do at your job. It predicts just a ridiculous amount of information. And the reason that it does that is because it's compressing this lifetime of decisions down into a number. It's not the number that matters. It's not how much money is in your bank account. It's all of these decisions factored into one number, right? And what it really measures is actually a personality trait called conscientiousness. If you're a very conscientious person, then it's going to show up in your credit score, and that has tremendous predictive value. So here's some things that you can predict by knowing aspects of people's personality. You can predict their individuals fit to a job. How well is this person going to fit this job? How well they're going to do at the job? How wealthy they're going to be over the course of their life? Their social success, how they're going to achieve, how well they're going to get along with other people, what kind of social success they're going to achieve. Their political orientation is very predictable by their personality aspects. Creativity, if they're high or low creativity, if they're going to be good artists, if they're going to do well in the creative field, and their emotional stability. Those are all things that you can read off of somebody's personality tests with fairly high accuracy.
May I ask a question now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, like on the political orientation, I've always heard that folks, and myself included, you tend to be more liberal when you're younger until you get out and start earning your own money. And so it seems like, so it seems like that would be a variable.
Yeah, that's true, actually, and it's true for an interesting reason. It's true that because it's bound to an underlying trait called openness that actually decreases over your lifetime. And that's interesting because most of your personality is relatively stable. It's very stable over the course of your life. There's a range. You have a range for your personality, and you can move within that, but the overall shape of your personality is usually similar throughout the course of your life. But that's not true with openness. That's the one trait that tends to vary most. And so there's an architecture under this, and I'm going to show it to you.
Cool.
Okay, so obviously this stuff is tremendously useful, but the problem is we can't really take psychology seriously because we've been belittling it for the past 50 years or whatever. But we need to take it seriously because they've got all this great technology. So what we did is we named it to cognitive science. It has science in the name, and so it must be good. And so we can take it seriously. Okay, so let's think about if you had to solve this problem, and this is the problem that the psychometricians, or the personality scientists, had to solve. If you had to characterize people, your boss comes to you and says, "We have all these customers, users, whatever they may be, and they behave in different ways when put into the same situation. And we need to come up with some model for how they behave. Like, here you are, you're a data scientist. How would you go about doing that? Anyone have any idea?
Methodical, right? If you're a data scientist, you're going to be real methodical.
Okay, but like step number one is you're going to need some data, right? First you get data, right? Okay. Now then, when you've got the data, what are you going to do with it?
Organize it.
A little bit more. Wrangle it. What are you looking for?
Who's going to buy our product?
Yeah, engines. Specifically, what are you looking for in general? You're looking for patterns, somebody said. You're looking for patterns in the data, right? You're going to have to, because what else do you have, right? That's all you've got. You've got to let the data tell you the story. And so that's what they did. Okay, so psychometrics is the science of finding or identifying personality and finding a model for it. And the way that they worked is by gathering data, and the data that they gathered is through personality tests. So who has taken a personality test? Okay, a couple of people. Oh, there's more. All right, who took one because of the note that I put up on this meetup? Anyone? Oh, one person did. All right, good. Okay. So for those of you who haven't taken a personality test, it's a series of questions, and they ask you things like from a scale of 1 to 5, positives and negatives, like other people respect me, I finish what I start, I'm sometimes afraid of social situations, right? And it's this huge series of questions like that investigate all the different aspects of your personality. So in the beginning, they just came up with all the questions that they could, and they gave them to as many people as they could. And then they started trying to find patterns, and they found that some things covaried. So, for example, if you answer yes on this question, you're likely to answer yes on this other one over here, and no to this one over here, etc. And then they tried to reduce that into the dimensions, the fewest dimensions possible along which they covary. Okay, and we would do that probably by using PCA or maybe LDA or some factorization algorithm. They actually have a more sophisticated one called factor analysis. So you might want to read about factor analysis. It starts with PCA, essentially, and then it handles the error differently. We distribute the error along our eigenvectors, but that's not okay for them. They're like, no, we know there's systematic error in the way that people answer things, and we want that factored out separately, and so they have a more sophisticated technique for doing that. But the interesting thing about this is it's a purely data-driven approach. They didn't start with any model, they just let the data tell it.
Real quick, are you planning to share the slides at the end of the talk?
Yes. Okay. So here's what you get out. So there are various models of personality, but this one is the oldest, the best studied, the one that has the most research. It's called the Big Five model, or the five-factor personality model, and it divides personality among these 5 independent major traits, and they're independent. So they're openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. What do they mean? We're going to get into that. But first, you got to have a warning, because there's gender differences in here, and they're actual real gender differences. Like, they're linked very strongly. There's tons of data on them. Men and women vary in certain traits, and it's a statistically significant trend. So if data and science bothers you, you're probably in the wrong room. All right, and one more thing is that we want to remember something about statistical distributions here, which is that here's the averages. When we say that let's say women are on average higher in trait agreeableness, which they are, that means that in statistical aggregate there's some difference between the average. But human beings have a huge overlap, and so what that means is an individual man or an individual woman could be anywhere within this area of overlap, right? So it doesn't tell you that much about specific individuals until you get to the edges. Now, at the edges, that overlap dies off. And so what that means is that if, for example, women tend to be higher in trait agreeableness, that of the most agreeable people, they're going to overwhelmingly be female. And of the most disagreeable people, they're going to overwhelmingly be male, right? Disagreeableness predicts, disagreeableness and low intelligence together are a strong predictor of criminality. And so the reason that more men are in prison, which there's dramatically more men in prison than women, is because they tend to have low agreeableness. That's a predictor for criminality. If you're a person who's disagreeable, doesn't get along with other people very well, and maybe isn't all that smart at covering up your crimes, you often end up in prison.
Are you saying that women are smarter than men?
No, intelligence is different. So, and I said we weren't going to touch that in this case, so we're not. But I didn't disagree either. Okay, so let's talk about these 5 traits. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I got a question about the traits. So
Yeah.
you were mentioning openness as one that changes over time.
Yes.
Obviously, like, only controversial say that like the other 4 could be trained to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you train somebody to be more agreeable or more extroverted, does that show up in the data?
Good question. Yeah, that's actually a great question. And the answer is yes, within a range. So there's some range by which you can vary your personality, right? And a great example of this will be agreeableness has its pros and cons. In fact, let's just jump ahead and do agreeableness because it's a good opportunity to talk about it. If you're agreeable, right, that means that you have these properties. You value harmony, you're cooperative, you're trusting, optimistic, considerate, kind, generous. Those are all nice things. And actually, this is the first of the 2 traits that are statistically different, significantly different between women and men. This one, women are higher in trait agreeableness, which sounds like a good thing, and it is a good thing in some ways. However, if you're low in agreeableness, which makes you disagreeable, that tends to make you much better at negotiating, executive leadership, and economic success. Right? Why is this? There's a reason for it. It's pretty interesting. The reason is when you're highly agreeable, what you're good at is factoring other people's point of view into your outlook. Okay? That makes you better at navigating social situations, and it means that you're going to be better liked. However, when you're negotiating for things, what makes you successful in negotiation is advocating your point of view to the exclusion of other people's. Even in a win-win situation, even if you're a win-win negotiator, you still need to make sure that your needs get met, right? And as opposed to compromising in favor of other people's needs, what you'll do is figure out how to meet your needs and their needs, right? So you're a better negotiator if you're lower in agreeableness. And if you take a negotiation training class, essentially what they're doing is teaching you techniques to kind of overcome your own innate agreeableness and try to, set it aside and advocate for yourself, for example, as if you were advocating for somebody else, right? So that's how that would work. And that correlates to, that's why you get higher economic success, because given the same job, and this is actually one of the reasons that men make a little bit more than women on statistical averages, they negotiate better. And they negotiate better because on statistical average they're a little less agreeable. And so they're more willing to say, yeah, well, that's all well and good of the company, et cetera, but, I need my raise. Right? So in negotiation class, they'll teach you to do less of that.
Are those traits probably learnable by people, and they would be enhanced, by skills and training?
Yeah, so the traits are innate. They're the dimensions among which your personality varies. But you can learn techniques to improve your performance along a trait, or to compensate. And I'm going to show you some good examples of that. But one thing we can do here, let's go back to conscientiousness. Okay. So if you're conscientious, you're orderly and organized, you're attentive to detail, you're dutiful, you're self-disciplined, that's a high predictor of job performance. And I think it's fairly obvious why, because modern jobs, they're the kind of jobs where if you show up to work on time and you keep a list of what you're supposed to do, and you remember to call back your sales leads, and you remember things about them, and then you do better at your job, right? So being conscientious is a good predictor of job performance. And the same thing is true for school. If you keep good notes, if you have a schedule, etc. And there are concrete techniques that you can teach people, even if they're let's say that your conscientiousness is sort of fixed within a range and you're not going to get more conscientious. You can still learn techniques to compensate for that. You can learn how to use a calendar, right? And that kind of like, it's sort of like faking it until you make it. You learn what a conscientious person would do and do those things, and then the net is you end up kind of being essentially de facto more conscientious, right? it's also a high predictor of political conservatism. And this is kind of interesting because it's thought that this has something to do with categorization. So people who are more conservative tend to want stronger categories around things, right? They want things in their little boxes. Now, we'll go look at the counterpart to this, sort of. Openness to experience. So people who are open to experience, high in openness to experience, they are adventurous. They like to try new things. They like to break categories and mix things together. In fact, great artists are almost always very high in openness, and that's a predictor of your artistic ability, right? They're also very imaginative, and openness is a strong predictor of political leftism. But wait a minute, you're saying, you told me these 5 traits are independent. So how can these 2 independent traits predict essentially political opposites? And that's a good question, because you can be high in both of them, right? You can be high in openness and high in conscientiousness, or low in both of them. And the answer is that our political map is wrong. And that's why, for example, you could be a centrist or a libertarian or someone who actually is high in both and believes that, boundaries should be broken wherever possible, but categories should be preserved for purposes of making categorical decisions. And those are not actually opposite things, which is pretty interesting. And this actually shows something else, which is that it's thought that, what I'm showing you is the architecture of how your brain is built, right? The actual neural wiring of how a human brain is put together. These are independent subsystems in your brain, and they load on different subsystems, and some of them actually tie to specific hormones and things like that. You can actually almost go through and say, this hormone, or technically the hardware that is upregulated by this hormone, this system, right, is most responsible for classification. Classification is actually on the, it's loaded on the disgust system, of all things.
Loaded into what? What did you say?
There's a system called the disgust system.
Disgust.
That helps you categorize what is you versus what is not you. And the psychologists, these guys are a barrel of laughs. They do all kinds of fun experiments, like have you take a sterile beaker and spit into it, and then they measure how many seconds before you're willing to re-swallow it, right? And the answer is within a second, it's not a problem. But why is it a problem? It's the same thing, but it's not the same thing. You've got hardware, you've got systems in your brain that are designed to do things, and that system specifically is trying to keep you free from parasites and diseases and things like that. And we use that hardware to do a lot of our decision making, and it actually shows up in our personality traits. So that's kind of interesting.
Question.
Mm-hmm.
I remember, what is that show where they had to do disgusting things on the island to survive?
Oh yeah, I know that. Yeah.
I always wondered, is that changing us as a society to decide things aren't disgusting anymore? Because I always thought disgust was this is something we should have, we shouldn't lose. Is that anything that's been talked about?
You can certainly learn to tolerate more. And you can learn to tolerate more of a lot of different things, including things like pain or emotional pain, or like people. There's one of the psychological researchers who talks about, he has clinical practice, and he talks about people who have panic disorders or psychological problems that cause great anxiety. And the therapy for that is essentially inoculation. They'll teach you, they'll expose you to a little bit of the thing and a little bit more of the thing. And what happens is you're learning that you can take more than you thought you could. And so your systems are dynamic. You can kind of re-regulate what you consider to be bad. And so in the case of that show, they're re-regulating what they learned is disgusting. Well, maybe that's not that disgusting. Okay, maybe it's just another kind of meat or whatever. And so that's how it works.
And openness to experience what you were saying. Sometimes that seems real superficial. If there's if you wanted to learn to scuba dive or fly an aircraft or something, something that requires some ability and adeptness at doing things, or if you just wanted to run out into traffic, it seems, which would be something new, but it would be stupid. You see what I'm saying? So
I'll give you an example that goes down the lines you're talking about. Recreational drug use,
yeah,
especially hallucinogens and things like that, right? And we saw this in the 60s. It was the age of Aquarius. Everyone got into, oh my God, you can open your mind, and you can, and that has dangers and consequences, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't necessarily just, just not do anything that has consequences, because everything has consequences. And yet at the same time, there's some balance. So people who are higher in openness are going to be more exploratory, and they're going to discount the negatives and value the positive side of the experience more. There's stuff in there that you don't know. You can learn all these great things. People who are low in openness are going to say it's not worth it, right? So low openness and high conscientiousness are actually different things. Right? And there's one more of these big five. Let me get to that. Extroversion, right? No, two more actually. Sorry. So extroversion is your willingness to engage with the outside world. So I think we all know what extroverted people are like. They're enthusiastic, they're action-oriented, they're assertive. Whereas introverted people, by comparison, are more reserved. They're contemplative. They have an easier time being by themselves. So there are advantages to either one, right? And finally, we get trait neuroticism, which is the worst named trait. Neuroticism is really problematic. It's a terrible word. What they mean by it, and it's a terrible word for two reasons. It's overloaded in psychological terms because Freudian psychology uses neuroticism to mean a certain thing. It's overloaded in pop culture because we use neuroticism as essentially an insult. But what psychometricians call neuroticism, because they're terrible at naming things, and you'll see more examples of that later, is susceptibility to negative emotion. Okay, so if you are higher in neuroticism, negative emotion actually affects you more. Given the same stimulus, let's say, two people have a relative die, and they're both, they both have the same experience, but one is low in trait neuroticism. They're going to tend to shrug that off much better, and the person who's high in trait neuroticism is going to be, deeply wounded by it. And it's not just that they're processing it poorly; it actually hurts them more. Right? If it were pain, like physical pain, it would hurt you more. So it's like upregulating your pain receptors, right? It's doing the equivalent of that with your emotional processing. So people who are higher in trait neuroticism, actually the world is tougher on them. They're more anxious, they're more stressed out. And this leads to being a good predictor of mental illness. So if you're higher in trait neuroticism, you're more likely to be mentally ill, which is not surprising because if you're stressed out and anxious all the time, that's not a healthy state to be in. It does have an upside, the increased attunement to the social landscape. In fact, people who are higher in trait neuroticism are more realistic than people who are not. So it gives you an accurate view of the world. And the reason, I kind of had this hypothesis in my own head that the reason that it makes you more anxious and depressed is the world's actually a pretty nasty place. We're just very good at forgetting about it. And I'm actually really low in trait neuroticism, and I'm a terrible estimator. Like I'm always like, my wife just laughs at me all the time. She's like, I don't let you estimate anything. You're too optimistic, and I'm like, you're too pessimistic. But then we sat down and took psychological tests, and it turns out that she's dead on. I'm just too optimistic.
Is this the trait that has been used to describe entrepreneurs, the ones who are going for a startup? Because I remember reading about this particular trait. They have a very optimistic view that their product is going to be wonderful.
Low neuroticism would do that, but also high openness probably. So if you were low in trait neuroticism and high in openness, that's probably a good predictor for being an entrepreneur. That's what you want for a psychological makeup. Yeah.
Along those same lines, do psychologists ever talk about emergent properties of people, maybe a combination of one or two of these, creating a new property that behaves differently?
Yes, we're going to see later on when we get into facets that there are individual facets that give more detail, and also there are different. These aren't the only dimensions along which you classify personality. There are other models completely. So one good example is there's a primate model for primates that is similar to the Big Five, but it includes dominance. And it's actually not clear to me that we shouldn't be measuring dominance, because dominance is a dimension on a human political or social interaction. Right? It's actually pretty significant. We play these dominance games with and it's very sophisticated. So that would actually be a useful thing to measure as well.
So one of the things that's kind of occurring to me is that how much of this is based upon the times that you're in. for example, what is considered not normal today, whatever normal is, was probably maybe considered extremely normal 400 years ago, 500 years ago. So in other words, that
Yeah.
needle is continually being reset. And
Yes.
that time period can be months, years, years, what decades, whatever it is.
Right, that's true. And actually, when we get into the scoring, you'll see that these traits are all relative, which is actually kind of annoying from a data science point of view because, you can't get 90% extroverted. You're in the 90th percentile for extroverted. You have to measure personality relative to a cohort of your peers at the current time. And that causes problems when you want to compare like between different countries and etc. So yeah, it is relative. And that's implicit in the data. Okay, so the other thing that will get you beaten up, but is unfortunately true, is that this is heavily loaded on estrogen. And we can tell that because what happens is boys and girls score essentially identically on trait neuroticism until puberty. And then women's trait neuroticism shoots up and it ends up being on average half a standard deviation higher, which is quite significant. And it stays there essentially through their lives. So it is thought that this is an adaptation to childbearing, that in evolutionary history, women were more vulnerable because they were carrying a baby or were pregnant for a significant portion of their life, and that human babies are extremely vulnerable, right? And so because of that, the estrogen actually upregulates the systems that attune you to the social landscape, which is critically important because we're a social primate, and to danger about the world in general, makes you more realistic and less optimistic. Right? So that's the supposed, the theory behind it. And
Did that carry forward with estrogen enhancement if it was gender reassignment?
yes, actually, that was the other thing I wanted to talk about. Yes, in fact, you can see this. If you talk to an MTF transsexual, which is a really valuable thing to do, about how estrogen affects you, it upregulates your susceptibility to negative emotion, and they'll tell you that. And the testosterone upregulates other things actually. So the other direction is also interesting. So yeah, you're not just some arbitrarily socially constructed thing. You run on real hardware, and that hardware actually has regulators in it that can be adjusted, and that will affect your personality.
I have a question. So obviously most of these personality tests are probably conducted on adults.
Yes.
So like very critical sort of like when you look at the development of children and stuff, there's a lot of thresholds that you have to hit.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's not always clear with a personality trait like this how many things are actually environmental and how many things actually are completely hard-coded.
Right.
Have they done any studies with these traits, like with soldiers pre-war, post-war, or anything else where you'd be able to predict like very significant environmental factors that actually might shift personality traits?
Yeah, that's a really good
might
question.
cause an increase in hormone or decrease.
Right,
in
exactly.
Okay, so we know about the effect of hormones through trans people, so we can study that. I don't know of soldiers, but that would be a really good one because certainly a traumatic enough experience. You think that the personality is not that flexible, but there's some flex in it, right? And it could move you exactly to one end to the other. And what you're talking about with children, that's interesting too because children's personalities are not formed, and so it turns out that they can't get. There's an entire area of like trying to figure out children's personality, but you can't generally apply the big five traits the way that you can in adults. And they have all kinds of work trying to work that out. Like there's arguments about what age you can apply what traits, etc., etc.
Yeah.
It's a really good question.
Building on this question here, I can trace my path in this seat to a couple of major chaotic or catastrophic events in my life
Yep.
that represent these like 90-degree path changes.
Yes.
And the other thing is, I myself operate off of two modes. My normal analytic mode,
Yep.
but when the proverbial shit hits the fan, I kick into HR mode,
Yep.
which is my people mode, because most often when you're in those overloaded situations, you're not going to solve it with data, you're going to solve it with your interactions with your people.
Yeah.
So are those sort of factors, like those life-changing factors or these overload factors, factored into this?
No, and remember that personality plus intelligence will give you about 50% of people's behavior, but that other 50%, that's terra incognita. There's no model for that. We don't understand how it works.
Yeah.
So this is good in predictive power, but there's a lot more to us than that.
Yeah, it's also important to note because all of these are like self-reported.
That's
if
true.
somebody who might be like high neuroticism, so they might experience more anxiety, might report themselves lower on extroversion, even if they're highly extroverted, because if they happen to experience anxiety in social situations that they're uncomfortable with, they'll report themselves as socially anxious, even if that's actually coming from a different trait.
Yep,
So
self-reporting
you
is
have to be
actually
a little bit careful.
self-reporting is a really good topic, and it doesn't have to be self-reported. You can analyze other people's personality, and so one technique is to have a number of your peers analyze your personality. And we're actually going to do that. We're going to do a little exercise to analyze some other some movie character, show characters' personalities.
How much of this is, I'm trying to word this right, how much does culture play into this? Because there are certain cultures in the world where, things like this, they're not going to care. They have a completely different set of priorities.
Right, so
you put somebody in like the Sahara Desert,
right,
or somewhere where it's like a very hostile environment, and they've grown up there. They are not going to have the same outlook on life as somebody who's sitting in here.
So the dimensions of personality, this is essentially your software running on top of your hardware, right? That's not, it's not culturally dependent. However, how well you do in a culture may well depend on what the culture values, right? So all of these things are useful. Like the reasons that these guys get into the evolutionary biology, and evolutionary biology offends everyone but tells you that everything is for a reason. Like if we vary over any kind of range, it's because it had some evolutionary advantage in our past at some point, which may or may not be applicable to today's culture. But for example, like autism,
Asperger's.
yeah, exactly. It's like, well, it turns out that our modern world tends to have some advantage. Those people have advantages. Like if you're really good at, say, focusing for 8 hours on writing computer code, which is a highly abnormal type of personality, it's advantageous. So what you really need for success is you need a mix of different personalities so that you can they can cancel out each other's weaknesses. It's actually it's equivalent to machine learning. The reason you do ensembles. The reason, this is actually the technical reason why you want diversity in a company or something like that. And by diversity, I mean really, especially diversity of personality, the way that people act. Experience may or may not help you with that. It does hurt, but coming from different cultures and things like that. But what you really want are people who are good at different things. And the reason that you want that is because they can compensate for each other's weaknesses, leaving their strengths. It's the same exact reason that you ensemble your machine learning algorithms, because it will explore more of the space and be able to deal with more of this tremendously complex world that we live in. Alright, so now, here comes the fun part. We're going to actually try to assess some people's personalities.
Can you come back another time and talk about maybe the plasticity of some of these traits?
Yes.
Do you have time?
Yeah,
Some more
yeah.
plastic.
Yeah, okay. Alright, so I've got three characters here. We've got Davos Seaworth, we've got what's his name? Stannis, thank you. Stannis Baratheon and Daenerys Targaryen. So if anyone doesn't watch Game of Thrones, you're going to be at disadvantage. Let's think a little bit about how these would go. So this is openness to change would be their level of adventurousness, right? This would be how they thrive in different environments, whether they like different foods, different places. They're big travelers. They're just more adventurous in their outlook. Low openness to change would mean they're kind of more conservative in the sense that they're homebodies. They don't really like to experience all much different. Conscientiousness would be how detail-oriented they are, how they respect rules versus being just disorganized, right? Organization versus disorganization. Extroversion would be whether they are outgoing, whether they're people, or whether they prefer to be by themselves if they're more introverted, and how well they function by themselves. Agreeableness would be whether they see other people's points of view, or if they're low agreeableness, how good they are at advocating their own point of view. And then neuroticism, trait neuroticism, susceptibility to negative emotion, worst named trait, would be how they react when they're faced with trauma or emotional pain. Do they shrug it off, or does it deeply affect them? All right, so form your opinions. And this is how I scored them. Okay. It's subjective, but you can do this. And actually, if you get a couple people to do this, there's one school, like I was saying, is of rating other people. You can do that, and if you get a bunch of people around you to rate you, it's pretty accurate. So we start with Davos and Daenerys. They're both high in openness. They're both adventurers, right? They travel to a number of different places. They put themselves into different societies, and they thrive there, right? Daenerys goes from society to society, and she's just a thriver wherever she is. Davos starts his life as a smuggler. He's very adventurous, travels over to Essos, which most people from Westeros have never been to. Now, in terms of conscientiousness, Davos and Stannis are both very conscientious people. They are both very law-abiding. Stannis doesn't even want to be king, but because the law says that he should be, he goes and fights an entire war over it. Davos is punished by Stannis for smuggling, despite the fact that the smuggling saves his life, and accepts that punishment honorably because he believes that the law is extremely important. That's the basis of these two's relationship. If you're like, why do these two get along? This is why. It's right here. And also this, down here, low susceptibility, negative emotion. Extroversion, and Daenerys, by comparison, she's not that orderly. She thrives among the Dothraki, who lack things like schedules or fixed routes or any type of real social structure, right? So she's not particularly orderly, doesn't really bother her. Extroversion, Daenerys is extremely high. She's very much a people person. She's constantly surrounded by crowds. She's just a social animal. Stannis is medium-low. He is respected but not liked. People don't really like him very much. And he compensates by using Davos to do most of his social interaction, because Davos, although he's similar and has similar views, is higher in extroversion. Okay? Now, when we look at agreeableness, Davos is medium-low, and both Daenerys and Stannis are low. And that makes them very good at advocating their point of view, and this is typical of major players in the Game of Thrones, because they're playing the game to win, right? Not to get along with other people, not to be peacemakers, they're there to win. And if other people lose, that's their problem. Okay, and now in trait neuroticism, all of them are susceptible, or have very low susceptibility to negative emotion. And that's actually very significant for Daenerys, because she's got an inherent bias to be like half a point higher, because she's got more estrogen. In fact, she's young. She's young, a young female. So for a young female to be really low is very significant. That mark makes her notably low. She's really good at shrugging off traumatic events to an extent that's quite notable. She's really a personality outlier. Okay, we're going to do 3 more. Okay, so we have Queen Cersei Lannister, Sansa Stark, and her sister Arya Stark. So again, think about who's open to change, who's an adventurer versus who's a homebody, who's high in conscientiousness versus low, who's detail-oriented versus not particularly organized, who is extroverted, is a people person versus kind of more introverted, who is high in agreeableness, seeing other people's points of view and incorporating them into their worldview, versus low in agreeableness, it's their way first, and who is high in trait neuroticism, that is, the world affects them, and emotional pain really gets to them, versus low, and they're able to just shrug off things that normal people would be crippled by. And here's how I scored them. Okay. So in terms of openness, Cersei is the lowest character in Game of Thrones, because she travels physically. If you look at where she goes, the least of all. She's a creature of court. She's happy not even in her city, but in her part of her castle. Like, that's it. That's all she needs. Whereas Arya is very much an adventurer, much like Davos Seaworth. She travels to other continents. Just wherever she randomly ends up, that's great, and she likes it and learns about it. Sansa is medium low. She's not quite as much a creature of court as Cersei, but and she travels more different places and learns more different things. But left to her own devices, she'd probably be happier staying closer to home. In terms of conscientiousness, both Cersei and Arya are low. They're both poor students. Arya is bad at needlework. That's one of her character's attributes. Sansa is high. In fact, she's the highest character in the Game of Thrones. Her hobby is needlework, very precise, and she's great at it, right? When she's running the castle at Winterfell, she turns out to be a superior administrator because she remembers everything. Her attention to detail is absolutely top-notch. She remembers every little detail about what has to be done and follows up on everything. So these people are great project managers, and Sansa would probably be an excellent one because her conscientiousness is so high. In terms of extroversion, again, these are creatures of court, and it's interesting that Cersei and Sansa, despite the fact that they're sort of enemies, do have something of a relationship, and it's based on the fact that they're both the same level of extroversion. They're both creatures of court. The court is where they interact, the social interaction landscape of court. That's where they live and how they operate. Whereas Arya is more of a loner. She's medium low. Agreeableness. Cersei is very low. And again, she ends up sitting on the Iron Throne because it's her way first. Arya is also low. By the way, what's Arya end up being in the story? Anyone watches the story? Assassin, right? Would you say Arya's smart?
She's an assassin.
Yes. Oh, assassin.
Yes?
Oh.
Maybe. Okay. Would you say she's a criminal? Yeah. Killing people for a living is
Probably.
yeah, like, remember when I told you that low, agreeable people tend to be criminals? Well, or can be criminals. Okay, in terms of neuroticism, now, the other characters are actually pretty abnormal, right? These women are both more normal, and they're actually roughly similar. So both of them, pain really gets to them. Like, they suffer. Like, they both suffer in this series. Cersei Lannister suffers. Sansa Stark suffers. Bad things happen to them, and their enemies love to torture them, because Game of Thrones is full of sadists, and it hurts them, and they hate it, right? So, whereas Arya is a little bit more resilient. She's medium-low. Bad things happen to her. It hurts her, and then she's going to kill you for it.
I have a question.
Yep.
Why NLP on Cersei?
Why the low C?
Yeah.
No conscientiousness. Because she's a bad student, actually. This is one of the things when you read the book. She's poor at her lessons. She pays little attention to it, and actually she's bad at running the kingdom. Like, this is one of the things that in the beginning, her character, the only reason she gets the Game of Thrones because she's not a good maker of plans. She's not good at following things up. She's not detail oriented. The reason she gets onto the Game of Thrones is she learns to compensate. Remember our discussion about compensation? And the way in which she compensates is she gets the smartest guy in the kingdom as the hand of her king. And he's very detail-oriented. He's very high in conscientiousness. And he follows up on all those things and gets them done. So she learns to compensate for her inadequacies by using somebody else to do those tasks. And by the way, it turns out that there's a reason that we're social primates and group in social groups, because if you have the personality you have, and maybe you can increase different factors of it, but one really quick and easy way to compensate for your own inadequacies is to get somebody who doesn't have them and get them to do those things. And that's exactly what Cersei does. Okay, maybe one more question, then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back and actually apply this in the demo with IBM Watson.
I'm going to ask a quick question. How do you, these are very powerful statements that can make. Commercially, if you think about it, how to apply this in the real world, it can become pretty significant IP, right? Or in some cases, how you drive value, right, back into that particular person, right? What is important, what's not important, how they're going to react to certain things.
Right.
And this, are there any legal issues preventing companies from using this type of information and making decisions, whether it's around credit, around product, those types of things? Advertising, sure.
Yeah, I mean, so credit, for example, is very highly regulated. Like in credit, you have the Fair Credit Act, which means that you can't treat people differently if they have a similar monetary standing, right? So if you both have, say, the same credit score, I can't treat you differently, and I can't extend different terms. And working within a regulated financial company, that's taken really seriously. Auditors will go to the tiniest details of, like, you know, why did this person get this value for the trade-in versus this person getting this value? And so that can be, so yes, the entire regulatory landscape still applies, right? Can you use it? Well, we'll talk about a little bit more of that in the second part of the talk. The short answer is, yeah, there are definitely things that you can use if you think even about marketing. Let's say, you know, do you want to, you know, put up the ad for a sports car or a minivan? Well, you can make that decision, and you know, that's the kind of thing that people do already in advertising selection, and you can expect that these kind of tools could be used for that too. Okay, let's take a break and then we'll come back and get more questions at the end. I'm going to start up again. All right, I'm glad you're all excited. Now I'm going to show you a little bit more complexity, and then show you a demo, and then knock some holes and all this. One thing, somebody said to me during the break, you're incredibly brave, like, saying these things on the internet. Like, I didn't invent any of this. This is a whole field. Like, this is somebody's, you know, this is a whole area of psychological research. Like, I'm a physicist turned architect turned data scientist. Like, I just learned it. Like, so, don't give me that much credit. Okay, so one thing about traits is that the traits are kind of high-level psychological axes, but you can subdivide them into subdivisions that are called facets. So here's an example. Openness to experience can be subdivided among the 10-trait model into two individual facets called intellect and openness. And right now you should be getting the idea that psychometricians are bad at naming things, which I pointed out before, and is true. So intellectual stuff is not intellect. It's your intellectual curiosity, because remember, intelligence is a whole separate thing factored out somewhere else. So that's a terrible name. And then openness happens to be the same word as this one over here, so like these guys, they're just bad. Like they're just not good at this. But anyway, the point is that you can subdivide your main traits into individual facets. Now there are several different ways to do that, and that causes some complexity. So you can subdivide them into 10 facet models, there's 14 facet models, and 30 facet models. And they're all different, and so that creates issues where, like, you can't necessarily, if you take a psychology test and you do it under a 10 facet model, and then you have another one that has a 30 facet model, you can't compare them directly. So that's awkward. The big 5 traits can be compared, but the individual facets can be faceted differently, and because that's what they're doing is they're actually picking different sub-dimensions, and they don't compare directly. Okay, and now there's more complexities. We talked about this already. The scores are relative, right? You can't score a human being in absolute personality terms. You can only score them relative to other human beings, and the cohort's wrapped into the measurement, so they're all relative measurements. So when you get 90 on extroversion, it doesn't mean you have 90 points of extroversion. It doesn't mean you're 90% extroverted. It means you're in the 90th percentile for the data set for extroversion. Okay, so you have to be careful with that because it limits what you can do. It's not as nice as having an absolute score where you can just compare things literally. Also, because they're gendered, you kind of have to compare it with the gender sometimes. So, like, for example, Daniere is not all that unusual as human beings, but she's really quite low for a woman in her trait neuroticism, right? So there's a gender component to it, and you have to, that's why they'll ask you, are you male and female when you're taking a personality test? Because when they report the results, they want to give them relative to your cohort. They're picking your gender and using that as your cohort. Name choices are poor, we covered that. The traits are coarse because you can subdivide them. And so what that means is that you can have like an average value of a trait, and then there can be important information in the subtraits. You could actually be pretty extreme in one of the facets. And so that's worth paying attention to. And because the facet models are different, it's hard to compare them. Also, the facets don't have standard names. The big 5 traits, the eigenvectors of personality, have standard names. But if I make a 30 facet model and she makes a 30 facet model, we can call the facets different things. right? And so that's not clear, like, you know, which corresponds to what. So that's another issue. So once you get into the details of the fasting models, that can be annoying. And we're going to see some, we're going to look at IBM Watson, and you'll see some more of what that really means. So what we really want to do is be able to infer your personality. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Quick question. So it seems like the data set that you're that you're a part of when doing the test is going to play a huge role in what the outcome of the test is. In terms of which percentile you end up in.
That's true. Now, the way that psychometricians attempt to deal with that is by getting the biggest sample size they can.
And that was compelling the students, right?
Yeah, so the way that they used to do this was that they used undergraduates as research students because that was your source of people who could be compelled to take a personality test, which is long and complex, and like who the heck would just sit down and take a 500 question personality test? And then social media came around and it turned out that lots of people would. Right? So this area has really exploded because the ease of getting data has just gone through the roof, right? In fact, people will take personality tests all day long. They're tremendously interested in personality tests. And not only that, they'll go onto social media sites and create all this other metadata. And so I think you were asking about the issues of self-reporting, and those are issues because you have your concept of your personality, and other people might not agree with you. And one way of compensating for that is to have other people rate you. But another way is to look at something that's not your self-reporting, like for example, look at text that you wrote or actions that you took on a social media page or things that you liked or stuff like that. And so there's a whole other area of analysis based on that, and we're going to look at that right now.
There's also the issue of if you know that you are being that you're part of a test, your responses may not be the same as when you when you do not know that you're part of a test.
That is true. So it's very convenient if you can analyze somebody's text, right? Maybe something that they wrote under different circumstances. So so here's IBM Watson Personality Insights. Okay, and this is probably the premier tool for doing this type of analysis. In fact, there's really only two tools. There's IBM Watson and Receptivity, and Receptivity no longer offers their API for public use. They've embedded it in other products. So this is right now the only game in town because this research requires, you know, PhD researchers have devoted their lives to personality study and their whole teams, and it's kind of hard to get those things. So IBM kind of has the lock in the market right now. So what we're going to do is go use Watson to analyze personality, and it gives you two choices. You can go analyze tweets, or you can analyze a piece of text. The fact that tweets work is pretty interesting when you think about it, because they're not very long. But we're going to do text, and you can either put in your own text, or you can pick one of these canned texts, and I'm going to use former President Barack Obama during his 2012 debate. Now, you have to be careful with political figures, because a lot of times they don't write what they read, right? So this is debate where he's speaking extemporaneously, and there's a reason for that. And similarly with anything else, like song lyrics, like where the author is not necessarily consistent, you know, you get something out of it, but it's not necessarily measuring the personality of what you think it is. So you do need to be careful of that. Okay, so the first thing that happens is Watson gives you this first it tells you that you have enough words to have a strong analysis. It'll consider anything over 6,000 words to be strong. We'll actually get into what you really need for numbers later. And then it gives you this awesome personality survey. It's very easy to consume. It's very compelling. And as far as I can tell, it is not at all accurate. Which is really unfortunate because this is what everyone takes away from Watson. And I can show you reasons I think it's not accurate. One of the first ones is that right down here, there are 3 models that it's using. Now, we talked about the Big 5 model, but they're also using 2 other newer models called the needs and values model. Now, those, we talked about the terra incognita of other unmapped personality areas, so new models attempt to process those. But when I have tried needs and values, well, first off, they're not nearly as well established in academic literature. They're not as well studied, they're not as well proven, they haven't had as much data through them. And when I've tried them on my own data sets, I find that they work poorly. So unfortunately, I had access to a good amount of data, like college admission essays at one point, and so...
Is that Maslow's?
I'm sorry?
Is that Maslow's?
Maslow's needs. No, I don't think it is. It's
Based upon
no, it's this model called consumer needs, and I think it's intended to be more commercial. But I don't really know that much about that model specifically, other than it scores poorly, and so I don't pay much attention to it. Okay, over here is the JSON, and I'm going to view the personality traits in the sunburst visualization, and you can get all that data in the JSON, and it looks like exactly what you expect. It's all faceted out. It's got percentiles, and it's got human readable names and the kind of things that you want from your web service, which is how you consume Watson most of the time, right? This is a little demo website built to call the web service. The web service is really what you're going to do in real life. Okay, down here is the science behind the service. That's where you go to read more about how they built Watson and what it's doing for personality models. You should really read that. It's good. It's good stuff. And then here is kind of where the rubber meets the road. This is the faceting. So here are the different models: bad model, other bad model, and the big five model. And over here we have the big five values, but they're faceted out on a 30-facet model. So you see there's a lot more variation in here. So for example, President Obama is high in cautiousness, high in achievement striving. That's no surprise, right? You don't become president without being a motivated person. Pretty high in activity level, very assertive, right? President of the United States has, at the time of this debate, right? He's got all the cards, and he knows it. And he communicates as being very assertive. On the other hand, average on gregariousness, not very modest. Not that you really should be in a presidential debate. Not particularly emotional, very dutiful, and so you get a much more developed model of a personality from this. So that's the facets. Now, this is all well and good, but there remains the key question of, does it work? And the answer is, sort of, right? Here's what I mean by that. So, to illustrate this, I went and looked up which personality test Watson used in their science behind the service, and they used one called the PIP, and I found a 300 question version of that test, and I took it. And then I took my personal journal, which is 88,000 words, and from like back in 2005 or something, and ran it through. And this is what we get for results. Are those numbers good? They are not, right?
You said you did a personal journal?
Yes.
Do you think that's a better representation? You get your mask on, your mask off, as far as what your personality is?
You can kind of ask that question about any source, and I guess the only really good answer is if you consume enough different outputs and written enough different times, enough different ways, you're kind of hoping to converge on personality, and that's true on no matter how you measure it. There's what you put on this test, for example. And if you keep taking the test, if you took it 100 times, you probably get a better average over it, right? So, yeah.
So it'd probably be good to incorporate different types of writing that you've done?
Yeah, and that's for example, longer tests are better, more writing is better, so more data will help. But there remains the central question that these things don't agree, or the central problem that these things don't agree, and so that sucks because I just spent an hour rubbing you all up about personality, and so now you're really let down.
But what about plasticity over time, though?
What about what?
What about plasticity of traits?
Plasticity of traits. Well, let's get back to that later in the question parts. Let's start with facets here. So here's our facets, right? These are mine. And let's see if these are actually good. Okay, so what I did here is I did an analysis using those two data sources. Over here we've got our big five traits, and over here I've listed all the facets, and I've got them from the 300 question test, the PIP test, and down here at Watson, and I put a heat map on where green is good concordance and red is poor concordance. And if you look at it, you can see that it's more green than red, so that's promising. And specifically, 12 of the facets concur very well. 7 of them are pretty good, 8 of them are weak, and 5 of them are far off. Okay, and so that's Yeah, that's something, right? It's like, it's not spectacular accuracy, but it's okay. So more accurate than not. And that, this is just an example, but I found this, I've looked at this with fairly large data sets and I found similar results. And more importantly, it's been studied in a couple different academic trials that have found similar results. They give an accuracy of 60 to 70%. Again, not fantastic, but good enough to get some useful information from.
Especially the text is the only source of information we have.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty good for like scraping somebody's text. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, but there's certain facets that it's better at.
Yes, that's a great question. There are, and I can't quantify that, but I'm pretty sure that there are certain facets just from like looking at the data. That, yeah, it's better at some things.
Yeah, I was going to ask if the areas that are problematic, if they are clustering on certain.
It's a good question. I don't know.
Well, I noticed one that was particularly off was gregariousness, which, given that you were talking about sourcing a test versus a personal journal,
Yeah.
like how is a personal journal necessarily going to predict gregariousness, right? So that's
Right.
that actually, you would assume that the type of the format of the writing would actually heavily influence which ones are heavy predictors and which ones are bad.
Yeah, so let's talk about how it actually works for a minute. So Watson's going to, first off, bag of word this, and I've tested it by mixing the words up and throwing them in, right? So it's always a good way to see if something's using the bag of words is just jumble it and feed it back in. So it doesn't have any concept of sentence structure. It's actually just scoring words.
Okay.
All right, and so and again, any specific sentence can be well off, but if you have enough words, we're relying, goes back to the very beginning, we're relying on the deep structure of language to save us, because we have a crappy algorithm, but we've got great data, and so the rich language, data in language is going to save us over enough data. Mary, you had a question?
Well, I think I figured it out.
So, which one would you say represents you best, the Watson or your personality? How would you self-assess?
I actually didn't think about that. That's, let me see. I kind of doubt, to be honest, I doubt my own ability to assess my personality very well. So that's kind of, I'll get back to you in a second. That's a good question. I guess this is going to get into the highs and lows. We're going to talk about the highs and lows, and the reason for that is that what really defines your personality in a useful way is where you're different than the norm, right? And so they're both not bad on highs and lows. And if you confine yourself to highs and lows, you get better accuracy. And so that's one of the things I actually recommend that you do. I'm sorry, your question.
So as you kind of touched upon earlier in your presentation, some traits are more stable than others. I imagine that same can be said for certain facets being more stable than others. And you mentioned that your data set would be more robust if you took, the 300 question test repeatedly every day, maybe every week or something. And I think what's really significant is the two samples you're trying to compare are not equivalent in a kind of a time sample sense. I imagine your journal, you were writing something down every day, every week, over a great span of time, whereas the 300 question test is an instantaneous sample. So I don't know how equivalent that would be.
Right. That's a very good point. And the practical reality is, you've got to take point in time samples. It's a real problem, and it doesn't go away, right? Because what are you going to do? Like, you can't sample on somebody's entire life. You've got to work with what data you have. And so the real practical question is, well, how useful is the limited set that we have, given that is a problem, which it is, and it won't go away.
Let me ask you something. I think you said, so you said that the results are the same with just bag of words. So the words, and it's the same without sentence structure or anything.
Correct.
Well, then I guess I don't understand the richness of language. I guess because it, and if that's out of,
it's all about the words. In fact, certain political figures have noted that sometimes they have the best words, the words that matter, right? With your actual choice of words, and what's bound to them. So it's just words.
Okay. Well, and you said 7,000 or 8,000 words to get what's considered a good representation.
It like 6, but we can get less, and I'll get to that later on. Go ahead.
So what's the significance of pre-categorization. So you got the big five, 300 questions.
Right.
60 questions aggregated into one value, a percentile value, right? So there's a kind of a lot of loss of granularity, and then even when you go to the 30 factor, it's still like a 10 to 1 loss of data as you aggregate into that one, and then you compare that against an 88,000 word granular bag of words.
Yeah.
Is there a structural contrast difference? Like, can you do that kind of comparison? I mean, that's sort of an interesting thought. I don't know the answer to.
Well, that's a great question. Let's look at this case and see if we get a sense for whether we think we can do it. Right? So, here's one thing that I will, and this may give you a clue about that, at least in my thinking, what I think. And this part's not proven, but I'm going to advance it and make an argument for it, and you can see what you think. I believe that the high and the low values form a strong fingerprint that seems to be preserved pretty well when the document is cut down. Okay, and you can cut it down fairly severely. And so, as one data point of evidence, which is worth not very much, but will illustrate the point, I'm going to cut this essay down from 88,000 words to 1,418. Now, this is the last last couple entries, which, to your point, is more contemporaneous and theoretically should be more comparable to the personality test, although I didn't look at that. So here I'm looking at high and low signals. That's where I differ from, from the cohort significantly in personality. Things where I'm, unusually high and unusually low, and that's really what you care about. So what I got is green is confirmation, yellow is non-confirmation. So this much shorter text has 7 confirmations, 3 non-confirmations. So again, more confirmations than not, like roughly accurate.
So, and how did you call the, how did you go from 88,000 words to 1,400 words again?
I took the last 1,400 words of the 88,000 words.
What do you mean the last?
So, I just start at the end of the document. Right, start at the end of the document, count backwards 1,400 words, right? Slice off that piece, and then feed it into Watson again. Right, and this is just an illustration, but I have done this with significant data sets, and what I've seen is that Watson has pretty strong internal consistency, especially if you go on highs and lows, that the signals, high and low signals, are strong and will be preserved when you cut it down, and I've cut things down really quite radically. I've cut them down to about 115 words and seen a clear trend that you can, you still get better representation and non-representation. This data set is very long. It goes back to 2005.
So, did you compare your journal recently with the time you have taken the Watson test? Because your personality included.
Yeah, that is a good question. And actually, she was asking about that too. And I did not, but we could, because we have those 2 values. I just didn't happen to look at that comparison. But that's a good one. It's a really good question. And that gets to the stability of personality. It's claimed in academic literature that personality is stable over your lifetime, but I haven't really looked at that.
But taking the last sample, the last words, that weren't those the most recent? Didn't you do that with your second sample and
Yes.
found it being pretty consistent?
Yes.
So you did it, you sampled it.
So I sampled, I'm sorry.
You sampled like that, you wound up sampling with the recent.
Yeah, the 1,400 word
Grab
sample
it,
is
correct.
recent, exactly. It's the most recent ones. I'm sorry, I'm not.
Do you happen to know if there's an average number of facets that like a typical person would deviate from the mean in? Like, for example, in the previous slide you showed that there are about 7 areas where you deviated significantly.
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. In fact, I'd never really used the 30 facet until I just took it because Watson uses it, and so I'm like, well, I need an apples to apples comparison. One in the very back.
Yeah. So I piggyback on what you are, right? So will you ever take not only just the data, right, just the text data, but also like maybe health data or demo data or just behavior, spending patterns, those types of data sets, and cut it against this to see if you're able to get a better correlation?
Hasn't been done as far as I know, but this area is very fertile for research. Like I said, it's opened up, right? The East and the West have come together, and things that used to be very difficult are now easy. We can get this data very easily. We can run these tests very easily, and there are, a lot of PhDs written on this stuff. Okay, so So I believe that, and I can make a case for this, and I think that I haven't written a paper on it, but this would be worth writing a paper on, that you can get the personality fingerprint from the highs and lows, and then you can reliably identify an author. Again, not that well, but well enough to tell, for example, if it changes. So like one idea for this would be to do a proof of concept using academic prod, where you take essays and you look to see, does the personality analysis of the essays, or the highs and lows thereof, significantly change between submissions? And if it does, it's likely, if the essay is long enough, and it's even likely if it's short enough, because even short ones reproduce the highs and lows relatively well, it's likely that that essay was written by somebody else. Not definitive, but certainly enough to raise suspicion. Okay, and there's other applications. I think you talked about some here, where you could, for example, take the highs and lows and feed them in as feature signals into a machine learning algorithm, and then correlate them with other data, like, perhaps people who are extroverted are more likely to buy, red cars. Like, there's a little piece of pop psychology, and it might be true, right? So there's a lot of things that you can do with this in your own context, and you can think about your own applications.
Like, your journal, there's products out there like Grammarly. I like Grammarly. I use Grammarly,
yeah. And
so that improves your writing. And there's other products that are going to be if a lot of folks on social media use that to improve their writing, that it would corrupt the results. Then, right? I mean, and it seems like that stuff's going to become innate in many systems.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the bag of words is going to strip out most of the grammar, but it is going to fix the misspellings. Misspellings carry content, actually, and there's a whole field on metadata analysis about using, like, there's one guy who does an analysis completely on articles, on pronouns, things like that, and even like essentially discardable parts of language can carry a lot of informative signals. So could it corrupt it? Yeah, I mean, in some extent, but again, we're relying on the fact that language is really statistically rich data, and so if we get enough of it, we're hoping that the signal shines through the noise, and it does, because the signal in there is very strong, right? And that's all NLP depends on that, and personality analysis depends on it just as well. So I'm going to wrap up and then just 2 questions. Okay. In conclusion, so we have these personality models from the psychometricians. They are very useful. I taught them to you in under an hour, and then you were able to analyze Game of Thrones, and now you can go home and tell everyone you live with, why Queen Cersei and Sansa are actually, aligned in some attributes, and why Stannis and Davos are friends. Watson can analyze personality accurately enough for many applications. At the facet level, I've consistently found that the trait level is not very good, but the facet level is better. I don't know why that is, but it seems to be true.
It probably has to do with the interaction of the facets within each trait.
Yeah, although it's pretty weird, like, how they put the facet model together, because you think that you could do a weighted sum of some kind of the facets and get the trait, but I'm not sure they actually built it like that. I actually think that they measured, like, they just straight trained a machine learning model on 35 different outputs, and then and so the relationship between them is actually pretty complicated. And I say that because sometimes there'll be facets that are so low that you're like, you have an average score, and it's like, high value, high value, high value, and one really low value, and you're like, you really have to weight that value very, very high for it to affect the facet in that way. And maybe they do, but I have my doubts. So the facet highs and lows seem to form a stable personality fingerprint. This isn't proven, but you stare at data and you see patterns, and that's the pattern I see, so I bet that can be proven. And even small amounts of text seem to reproduce that fingerprint, and I've done a number of cut-down analysis, and that's what you get out of it. And then the highs and lows provide useful signals, and you can use them in applications, and probably people will, and that'll be exciting. And then before we get to questions, I'm going to show you some stuff for future research, and I refer you specifically to 2 different researchers. So one is Jordan Peterson from the University of Toronto. He wrote this book, Maps of Meaning, and more importantly, he has an entire college class online about personality. It's called Personality as Transformations, and it's this lecture over an entire class. So if you're really excited about this topic, you can get quite a lot of it. His lab developed the 10-facet personality test, or a 10-facet personality test. You can take it at understandingmyself.com. It costs $10, but it has really good explanations. I think it's worth $10. So there's that. And then this guy, we didn't really talk about what he does, but he's pretty interesting as well. He's James Pennebaker from UT Austin. Remember I told you there were two services. The first is Watson, the second is receptivity. Receptivity used to be available, like the demo that we just did, but it's not anymore. It's now embedded in other products. However, his lab studies language, and he actually came up with one of the first. It was called Luke, Language Linguistic Word Count, the first scored dictionary of words. Remember I told you it's all about the words, and words carry connotation, and he pioneered that work. He also has this. He's also studied pronouns, like for example things like dominance in social situations can be assessed very well through pronouns. If you use first-person pronouns in communication, you are most likely the subordinate, whereas your boss is less likely to do that. So if you look on secretlifeofpronouns.com, he has a TEDx lecture. That's like a 20-minute lecture, so that's pretty good, and it's about pronouns, and that's pretty interesting. And receptivity has his research. And then, that's it. Now we're questions, or if you're completely sick of hearing about this, you can
I have a thought, and it's gonna unfortunately kind of poke a hole a little bit in your hypothesis about being able to fingerprint people.
Yep.
Because my intuition is that some people have more stable personalities than others,
yeah.
and that some people will have more stable fingerprints than others. Someone, for instance, with a mood disorder who might, let's say bipolar, for instance, where you're very prone to experience high extroversion, highs, maybe low neuroticism when you're in a manic episode versus high neuroticism if you're in a depressed episode or something like that.
Yeah.
Probably a lot more introversion in a depressed episode.
Right.
I wonder if text produced at different times in a different cycle could have wild, dramatic effects on trying to ID a person, or even say if there's a match.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'll give you Peterson's answer, but I haven't researched this myself, and it would be worth checking out. And he may be wrong, right? Anyone may be wrong. So in his class, when he covers this, he describes that we have a personality trait, and then we have some range through which we vary. And so for somebody who has bipolar disorder, for example, the idea would be that they would generally score higher than the average person, the bulk of the population, in trait narcissism, but that they would range within. So that here's normal, right? That they would be over here somewhere within some range, and that range might also be greater than the norm, right?
Yeah.
Now, is that really true? I mean, he claims it, but everything should be subject to question. So it's a good question, and I don't know. I can't prove it.
I mean, I definitely maybe less on like questionnaires, but like if you're trying to, like you say, use this for academic plagiarism to ID somebody between writing, you're getting a bunch of very episodic things, and if their writing style is varying because their mood is varying highly.
Yeah, I have looked into this a little bit, and the way I did it was I took bloggers who wrote about different subjects, and I took different domains that they wrote about, and did cut-down analyses on those, and compared them, and they were more consistent than I thought. But and so there's some evidence there from that it does seem to go in that direction. But this is all testable, right? And this is the great thing about this is that we can test it to our heart's content. I mean, we should go find some people with bipolar disorder and take lots of personality tests and analyze their writing, and it's totally testable, and the barrier to doing that has gone way down.
Could this be applied to music? For example, composers, patterns of music, and so forth, wouldn't that? Because that's another expressive kind of way of doing things.
That's a great question. I guess, so in theory, you'd have to first characterize the music, right? Notes, intervals, other features, and then attempt to apply that. So you have to have, personality tests of the composer, for example, and then, but the problem with that is that they're actually writing to evoke a specific emotion. Or you could do something like this. You could have people rate the emotion of say this is a sad song, and then try to characterize the features out of that.
I mean, not just music. You could take art and do the same thing.
Yeah.
It does correlate with the language of the composer. So the rhythmical pattern in their primary language does correlate with the rhythmical pattern in the music that they compose.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, great idea. I have done lyrics, by the way, on it, and the problem is that frequently lyrics are written by different people. So it's hard to find somebody who really writes their own songs. but you can do lyrics as well. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm curious if the big five factor structure that we get from the test items, whether they hold for a text, because is there a reason to believe that through factor analysis, right, you may be getting different factor structure when you analyze text as compared to test items?
Yeah, that's another good question. And I don't know, I think it seems that they're all starting with the big five model and then trying to tie that to text.
Yeah, because when you
could you make a different model? Like just,
because
and
when you try to compare them, when you took the test and then you fed the text into Watson, it didn't agree. Well, it could be because of accuracy, or it has a different model.
That's an excellent point as well. It might be that we get 5 vectors, but they're not the same vectors, right? Yeah, that's a great point. I know that with Luke, the dictionary in particular, that there was a lot of work in revising it. What they found was that they'd score. Okay, these are the emotional scores, and the way that words correlate to the big 5 axes. And it changed over time. They would do bigger analyses, and it wasn't clear if it was changing because the language was changing or because they were getting more data. But yeah, it's again more data, many more possibilities, and those are really good questions.
I think it would be a really interesting study to look at some of the more recent developments where the AIs are generating text, like an AI poem, and people are trying to figure out whether or not it's a human that wrote it or an AI that wrote it, and run this analysis on the AI.
Well, Watson's publicly available, so
I think
I'll try that.
Real interesting.
Do you know of any formal studies that have been done where you have where people have tried to obtain unguarded responses from the subjects? Because I'm convinced that your responses they're very different if you're told that you're part of a test and you're trying to self-report, as opposed to when your responses are taken when you don't think that you're part of a test. And
right. So that's one of the reasons that people want to analyze text, because it's much easier. I mean, if I say, "Hey, take this, psychology test," I mean, I'm automatically putting you into a state where you're taking a psychology test. But if I just analyze your writings, you could have written them all, at all kinds of varying times. There's a lot more data, and so that's one of the reasons I think driving the desire to analyze personality from text. But again, we're really at the early stages of this stuff. Yes.
This is more of a personal question, but what's your personal interest in this area? Is Toyota Financial using these sorts of methodologies to offer certain financial products?
Not that I know of, although Toyota Financial is a large place, and so who knows what's happening across all of it. I certainly don't. But no, my interest in this started with professional engagement when I was a contracting data scientist, and it was a consulting engagement for a company that processed university applications, which have a lot of essays in them, and they're long, and there's a lot of reading in them, and so we were trying to figure out what we could extract, what value we could extract from these great bodies of text that we had, and this was some research that we could do with that. As well.
I wonder how this would work with people with different nationalities, especially people English is not the first language.
Right.
Probably it won't work at all.
So this is actually a really good question because NLP techniques in general are language specific. So the Big Five model is not language specific because it's an underlying personality model, and the Big Five tests have been translated into many different languages, and there's this whole issue of are the tests culturally relative, which the answer seems to be to a first crude approximation no, because you're asking about how people feel and how other people regard them, and those are things that are fairly universal across the human population, right? It's not like what the SAT question about orange juice or whatever, that maybe you don't have orange juice. It's not like that. They're asking about how you feel, how other people regard you, universals that do translate well across culture. However, in terms of Big Five analysis, Watson does support multiple languages. And so they probably have to train a completely different model to do that, because NLP techniques in general do not generalize across languages. Because it depends on the deep structure. You're fitting a bunch of constants to deep structure, assuming there's deep structure in the language, and it's different in different languages. Yes.
I pointed one of my sons to the Watson service. He was developing a use case for
Yeah.
a consortium. And so I said, well, when you get it finished, why don't you dump it into Watson and you'll get an analysis of what kind of provider you are, or whatever. And he took that, and he really wasn't happy with the analysis.
Yeah.
He went back and reread his paper just like, you know, an editor would. And he changed his use case around, and then when he finally finished it and submitted it for peer review, the people were like, this is a great written paper, you know, it's concise, you're explaining things well, but you're compassionate, and so he used it to augment.
That's a really good idea.
That's pretty cool, yeah.
Yeah, you're like, oh, this isn't conscientious enough. I'm gonna go back and like improve it.
Can you differentiate sentiment analysis from personality analysis?
Yeah, so sentiment analysis is
someone's writing happy versus sad.
Right. It's really just it's similar in its analyzing text, and it's similar in that it's scoring off the words, because they usually do bag of words technique. But what they're training the model for is, you know, the output is happy versus sad, versus when you train the model for Watson, what you're training it is matching the personality tests that then that's how they build them. They get, you know, 1,000 people to take a personality test and then give samples of their writing, and then they try to get the model to accurately reflect this personality test from this writing. Right? That's what they build it for, and then try to see if it generalizes to the general population. Yes?
Do you know any commercial use for this?
I can imagine about 1,000, but but what people have actually done with it, yeah, I don't know that I've seen anyone do anything with it, but I'm sure if you look on the IBM page that somebody has done something commercial with it. So that's kind of a better question for IBM, probably. Also, receptivity, like I said, they commercialized their stuff into products. I wasn't paying too much attention to what the products were because I just wanted to know whether the API was publicly available, which it's not. But those products assume that they have some kind of, you know, customers paying for them. So yeah, there's some commercial uses out there, but I'm not.
No, certain opposition research.
Okay, anyone who hasn't asked a question? Or
quick question, quick
I'm
comment.
gonna
I
let
would
these
think
guys.
that this would be used in interviews.
Brinks had me take an honesty test, and I got and the honesty question is similar to the personality test, but it's about, you know, would you steal? You know, would it be okay if, you know, you took $500 out of the money processing bag, but you were intending to put it back later, right? And it's just a whole bunch of questions about that. And so I took the test, and I went back to that boss, and I was like, who fails this test? And he said, sit down, right? Because a significant number of people do fail it. And then I thought, well, you know, is this really testing it? Is this like intelligence test, testing whether you can just answer the questions, like in the, you know, right? And then I got interested, and I went read. It's called the retest. I went and read about the retest, and no, the retest is relatively well researched. And the way they researched it is they gave it to large organizations, and they had them administer it on interviews, or on not interviews, but on after employment, right? Because there's issues with discrimination in interviews based on whatever you're going to use for a choice. But after people were hired, they had them take the retest. And then they sealed it up and never used it. And then they went back and measured the ones that got fired for theft and studied their retests versus the general population's retest. And so it turned out that they'd done a pretty careful study and that there was something there. And I think, this is pure conjecture on my part, but I think that what happens is it measures your ability to maintain a consistent point of view, because, and this doesn't catch a certain percentage of people who have a consistent point of view and are, you know, going to steal from you. But there's a certain type of liar who just lies to themselves all the time, and they can't keep it consistent. So what happens is they'll answer the question one way, and then the question's framed another way, and they adopt the framing of the question and they answer it. Again, this is my conjecture as to how it works, right? But I think that they don't answer consistently, and I think what it really measures is consistency. Now, somebody who developed the retest might be like, no, that's not how it works. But that was really what got me interested in how do these tests work, and et cetera.
That's exactly right. They do, within all these tests, they do, I guess, within subject variability. So they ask the same thing a multitude of different ways.
Yeah.
And then over time, they do test retest for the big five and all of that stuff. So it catches you, it gets to the core, and that's how they start the factor analysis.
All right, you've been a great audience, and I'm happy to answer questions if you still have burning desire, but we should let these people go home and get on with their lives. Go home and tell your cohort.